There is a car that has never won a race. It never broke a speed record. It never caused a single engineer at Ferrari or Jaguar to lose 1 hour of sleep. And yet, for nearly 20 years, it was one of the most desired automobiles on the planet. This is the story of the Karmann Ghia. Before we go any further, I want you to picture something. It's 1955. You're standing on a street corner, maybe Stuttgart, maybe Cincinnati, maybe somewhere in the north of England on a grey Tuesday afternoon. A car rolls past you. Low to the ground. Smooth. Sculpted like something carved from Italian marble, curves in all the right places. A roofline so clean and unbroken, it seems like the car is still moving even when it's completely still. You stare. The person next to you stares. Traffic slows, just slightly. Then you hear the engine. And it sounds, honestly, like a sewing machine that developed aspirations above its station. Because underneath that impossibly gorgeous body sits the mechanical soul of a Volkswagen Beetle, the exact same engine your dentist used to drive to work on a Tuesday morning. 1,192 cubic centimeters of air-cooled, practical, entirely unglamorous German engineering. 30 horsepower. That is your number. 0 to 60 miles per hour. Roughly 27 seconds on a good day with a gentle tailwind and a slight downhill gradient. The top speed sat at around 72 miles per hour, which, to be completely honest, is a figure that a determined cyclist on a decent road bike might reasonably contest on a flat stretch of road. And Volkswagen charged you more for it than a standard Beetle. More money. Same engine. Less performance. Longer waiting list. So here is the question, the one this entire video is built around, and it should be pulling at you right now. Why did hundreds of thousands of men, smart men, men who read the specifications, men who knew the numbers going in, why did they line up to own one? The answer is going to tell you something not just about cars. It's going to tell you something about desire itself. About identity. About the deeply human willingness to pay a premium for something that makes you feel a certain way, even when every rational fact on the spec sheet says you really shouldn't. This is how Volkswagen pulled off one of the greatest automotive illusions of the 20th century. Not with horsepower. Not with lap times. With beauty, nerve, and an Italian pencil sketch that changed everything. That it all begins in a city you might not expect. The city is Turin, Italy. The year is somewhere in the early 1950s. At this point in history, Italy's design studios, the Carrozzeria, are the undisputed masters of automotive beauty. Names like Pininfarina, Bertone, and Ghia are producing concept cars so breathtaking that American executives are flying across the Atlantic just to stare at them. The Italians understand something the rest of the world is still catching up with: a car is not just transport. It is theater. Carrozzeria Ghia is one of the most celebrated of these studios. Founded in Turin in 1915, it had survived 2 world wars and emerged in the post-war era with a reputation for producing some of the most elegant coach-built bodies in Europe. Its creative director in the early 1950s was a man named Luigi Segre, sharp, ambitious, with an eye for the gap between what the market offered and what the market secretly wanted. What Segre noticed, sometime around 1950, was this: Volkswagen's Type 1 platform, the Beetle, was mechanically simple, remarkably reliable, and produced in enormous quantities. And if you stripped away the Beetle's famously rounded body, what you had underneath was essentially a blank canvas. Segre saw the possibility before almost anyone else. He commissioned his studio to develop a low, elegant coupe body that could sit on that Beetle platform, something entirely different from the practical little car the platform was known for. Something that looked like it belonged at the Geneva Motor Show rather than the local car park. The result stopped people in their tracks. Smooth, flowing lines. A long, low bonnet. A cockpit that sat low and looked purposeful. It was, by any measure, one of the most beautiful production car designs of its era. Segre presented it to Heinrich Nordhoff, the formidable director general of Volkswagen, in 1951. Nordhoff was not a man known for impulsive decisions. He had rebuilt Volkswagen from near ruin after the war into one of Europe's most successful manufacturers. He was calculating, meticulous, and not easily impressed. He approved the project almost immediately. But there was a problem. Ghia was a design studio. They could draw the car beautifully and build a prototype. But producing it in any meaningful volume required a specialist coach builder, someone with the factory floor, the skilled workforce, and the tooling to turn a dream into a production reality. That someone was Wilhelm Karmann, based in the city of Osnabrück in Lower Saxony. Karmann's firm had been building coachwork since 1874. By the 1950s, they were one of Germany's most respected specialist body manufacturers. Nordhoff already had a relationship with them. Karmann had been producing the Beetle convertible. 3 companies. 1 platform. 1 drawing that changed everything. The clock was ticking. The production Karmann Ghia was shown publicly for the first time in 1955, and the reaction was immediate. People gathered around it in the kind of silence that only genuinely beautiful things produce, the silence before the applause, when the brain is still catching up with what the eyes are seeing. Automotive journalists, who had attended 1,000 launches, struggled to find words that felt equal to the moment. Orders followed almost as fast as the crowds. But here is where the story becomes genuinely revealing. The men placing those orders knew the specification. The numbers were not hidden. Volkswagen did not pretend this was a performance car. And yet the order books filled and kept filling. Part of the reason was the body itself, because while the mechanical platform underneath was standard Volkswagen, the body above it was anything but ordinary. Each Karmann Ghia coupe body was finished, in significant part, by hand. Workers at the Karmann factory in Osnabrück spent hours on the panel gaps, the curves, the surface finish that automated production lines simply could not achieve. The doors were fitted by craftsmen who adjusted them by eye and by touch until the fit was right. The bonnet alignment, front and rear, was checked and rechecked against a standard that went beyond what factory tolerance charts required. You were not buying a Beetle with a pretty dress on. You were buying a handcrafted object. And in the mid-1950s, in a world still rebuilding from war, that meant something very specific to the men who could afford it. Now, complete honesty, because this part matters. The weight of that handcrafted body made the car marginally heavier than the Beetle it sat on. That did not help the performance figures. The 30 horsepower engine, already not what you'd call spirited, had a little extra work to do just getting the thing moving. Early road tests in Britain and the United States noted, with varying degrees of diplomatic kindness, that overtaking on a motorway required, in one publication's words, considerable forward planning. The gearbox? Same 4-speed unit as the Beetle. The suspension? Same. The brakes? Drums all around. The steering? Same. On paper, there was almost no mechanical argument for buying this car over the standard Beetle. Except one. The standard Beetle did not look like this. And that was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough. Because something was shifting in the post-war world, particularly among men in their 30s and 40s who had lived through real hardship and were now, for the first time in their lives, beginning to have genuine choices about what they drove, what they owned, and what that said about them. The Karmann Ghia was speaking directly to that man, quietly, confidently. And Volkswagen's advertising was about to amplify that quiet signal into something extraordinary. Here is the part that most people misunderstand about the Karmann Ghia success. They assume it was accidental, that Volkswagen got lucky, that the car happened to look beautiful, happened to land at the right cultural moment, and the market happened to respond. That assumption is wrong. The Karmann Ghia's marketing campaign in the United States, which became the car's largest single market within a few years of launch, was one of the quietly brilliant pieces of automotive advertising ever produced. And the most remarkable thing about it was what it never said. Volkswagen's American advertising agency, Doyle Dane Bernbach, had already made history with their work on the Beetle. That campaign is still studied in marketing schools today. When they turned their attention to the Karmann Ghia, they made a decision that was, at the time, genuinely unusual. They never called it a sports car. Not once. Not in a single official piece of advertising copy. Instead, they let the image do the work. The car was photographed beside Mediterranean coastlines. Against European architecture that Americans in the 1960s associated with culture and sophistication. Parked in locations where you assumed interesting people went to have interesting conversations. One campaign leaned into the car's honest limitations rather than hiding them. They acknowledged it wasn't the fastest thing on the road. And somehow, that honesty made it more appealing, not less. It was a masterclass in the difference between what a product is and what a product means. If you bought the Karmann Ghia, you were not making a statement about your lap times. You were making a statement about your taste. About the kind of man you were, or the kind of man you chose to be seen as. That was, in 1960, a radical proposition in automotive advertising. The muscle car era was just beginning. Detroit was spending enormous money telling American men that raw power was the only measure of an automobile. Volkswagen, with a 30-horsepower Beetle engine and an Italian body, quietly suggested that perhaps power wasn't the point. A significant number of men agreed that in 1961, Volkswagen made a move that took the whole situation to another level entirely. They introduced a second Karmann Ghia, larger, sharper, even more expensive, and even slower. The Type 34 Ghia arrived in 1961, and it was something to behold. If the original Karmann Ghia, known as the Type 14, was beautiful, the Type 34 was in another category entirely. Larger proportions. Cleaner, crisper lines. A design that automotive historians still point to as one of the most elegant European cars of its decade. It was sold primarily in Europe in considerably smaller numbers than the Type 14, which made it rarer, and given everything we now understand about this story, inevitably more desirable. The Type 34 used a larger engine, beginning with 1,500 cubic centimeters and later growing to 1,600, producing somewhere between 53 and 66 horsepower depending on year and specification. A meaningful improvement over the original 30 horsepower. Still not a performance car, but no longer quite the same gently humorous gap between appearance and ability. It was discontinued in 1969 after just 8 years in production. Today, surviving examples occupy their own elevated tier in the collector market, precisely because of that rarity, but here is what I want you to understand about both versions of this car, and this is the part of the story that goes beyond automotive history. What Volkswagen, Karmann, and Ghia built together was not really a car. Not primarily. What they built was proof of a principle that the car industry, and then every other industry, would spend the next 60 years trying to copy, refine, and monetize. The principle is this: people do not buy products. They buy versions of themselves. When a man in 1963 walked into a Volkswagen dealership and ordered a Karmann Ghia, knowing precisely that it had 30 horsepower and a top speed a bicycle might argue with, he was not being foolish. He was not being deceived. He was making a completely coherent decision that had nothing to do with the spec sheet and everything to do with who he was choosing to become. He was saying, I value design. I value craft. I value something that cannot be measured on a brochure. I am the kind of man who chooses a thing for reasons that are entirely his own, and I will own that choice without apology. That is not a lie. That is arguably a more honest kind of purchase than most. And the fact that Volkswagen made this possible, that Ghia designed it, and Karmann built it by hand in Osnabrück, created something the industry had not quite seen before, a car that sold a feeling, delivered that feeling completely, and never once failed to keep its actual promise. The car was marketed as elegance. It delivered elegance without compromise. That is not a lie. That is a very particular kind of truth. But all truths, eventually, meet their limits. And by the early 1970s, the Karmann Ghia was about to meet its. By 1973, the world had changed in ways that no one at Volkswagen, Karmann, or Ghia had fully anticipated. The oil crisis hit the global car market like a freight train. Fuel costs spiked almost overnight. Consumer priorities shifted sharply. And the Beetle platform, already showing its age after nearly 3 decades, was beginning to look like a relic in a market that was demanding modern, fuel-efficient, front-wheel drive cars with water-cooled engines and contemporary safety standards. Volkswagen's answer was the Golf, launched in 1974. Front-wheel drive. Water-cooled. Modern suspension geometry. A genuine engineering leap forward. There was no version of the Karmann Ghia that could survive that transition. The Beetle underpinnings were not just the car's engineering foundation, they were baked into its proportions, its dimensions, the entire visual logic of the design. Remove them, and you had a completely different car. You had something that was no longer the Karmann Ghia. It had no soul left to sell. Production ended in July of 1974. Over the 19-year production run, approximately 445,000 Type 14 coupes had been built. Around 80,000 convertibles. And somewhere in the region of 12,000 Type 34 Ghias. For a handcrafted specialist car, these are extraordinary numbers. Outweigh, a clean, honest Type 14 coupe, properly restored, correct mechanicals, good panel gaps, will sell for somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000 in the current collector market. Exceptional examples in high-quality restorations go higher. Convertibles attract a premium on top of that. The Type 34, given its rarity and design prestige, commands its own elevated tier entirely. The men who bought Karmann Ghias new in the 1960s, drove them through the early 70s, and then sold them, stored them, or let the years take them. Many of those men, if you ask them today, will tell you the same thing: they wish they had kept it. Not because of what it would be worth now. Because of how it made them feel then. And that is the real lesson of the Karmann Ghia, the one that reaches well beyond cars and coach builders and post-war advertising campaigns. There are things in life the spec sheet cannot capture. Things that deliver their value in a currency that doesn't show up in a performance table or a resale estimate. Beauty is one of them. Craftsmanship is another. The quiet confidence of choosing something for reasons that are entirely your own, and refusing to explain yourself. The Karmann Ghia was called a lie because it looked like a sports car and drove like a Beetle. But the men who loved it were never confused about what they were buying. They chose it anyway, with full information, open eyes. That is not being fooled. That is knowing exactly what you value. There is a car that has never won a race. It never broke a speed record. It never caused a single engineer at Ferrari or Jaguar to lose 1 hour of sleep. And yet, for nearly 20 years, it was one of the most desired automobiles on the planet. Not because of what it did. Because of what it meant. The Karmann Ghia reminded us that the things we truly value cannot always be measured. They can only be felt. And when you find something that makes you feel that way, even if it's slow, even if it's impractical, even if the spec sheet says you should know better, you hold on to it. Because the fastest car in the world will only take you where you're going. But a beautiful car takes you somewhere else entirely. It takes you back to who you really are.